There's some general observations that we make as we exit the book of Genesis and begin the book of Exodus. And so I'll just quickly hit those and then we will begin. We will not make it very far, but we will begin the book of Exodus. What we did learn in the book of Genesis is that God is the God of redemptive covenants. And we see that God selected Israel as a choice to make one nation from all the nations in fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. This will be significant as we come into the book of Exodus because Exodus has to be read in the light of what Genesis has revealed. In Genesis, we learned that God's covenant with Abraham was the defining feature of God's plan of blessing after the very good beginning with Adam in the garden was lost due to Adam's sin. That's what makes, indeed, the understanding of the covenant with Abraham to be a redemptive covenant. It was lost, and now God is restoring, redeeming, bringing back what Adam lost in sin. And the Abrahamic covenant is this foundational redemptive covenant that God makes. And it is why we will see in Exodus the nation Israel will be brought into covenant with God at Sinai. We also see that God chose one descendant of Abraham who will bring the promised blessing to the nations, reversing what Adam lost in sin. So it's not all of Abraham's sons, but rather one son is the chosen seed that God then brought forth the nation of Israel, and it is going to be in one seed of Abraham that we will see the blessing promised to Abraham that will come to all the nations be fulfilled. We also see that one man will bring the restored world in a manner that fulfills this Abrahamic covenant, which will bring, in one sense, creation to its final end, which is reflective of the seventh day in creation week, where God's people will then enter into God's rest. The book of Genesis, in one sense, can't be overemphasized in our ability to understand redemption. If you have an understanding of salvation, if you have an understanding of what God does in Jesus Christ and how that is going to come to its completion in the future, but it doesn't require you to understand Genesis, then you do not have a correct understanding of redemption or God's saving work in Jesus Christ or how that will be completed in the future. Genesis is foundational to understanding God's redemptive work in Jesus, who is that promised seed of Abraham, who does bring the restoration of the cosmos because Adam and sin lost it. And that really begins with the Abrahamic covenant. We did learn specific things about God in the book of Genesis. Here's a quick list of 7 things that we learned. We see that God is living, that is to say, that he is eternal. We learned that God is sovereign, that is, that God rules with absolute power over everything. So we therefore could understand that this world is God's kingdom and he is its king. He rules over it and in it. We also saw that God is powerful. That is that when it comes to power, God is not limited in any way. And if he decides that he will destroy all flesh with water, he does it. If it is to create all things out of nothing by a word, he does it. We also saw that God is righteous. That is, that what God does is always right. And therefore, God requires that all of those who are acceptable to him, they have to be made right. We saw that God is holy, which is in one sense similar to righteous. But it also indicates that God is wholly other, WHOLLY. When God creates the world out of nothing, God already exists. So God is not a creature. God is not a part of this creation, though he personally interacts with his creatures to accomplish his purposes. But God is outside of and other than creatures. This is a part of what it means when God is holy. We also see in God being holy is that there is a separation that is required between God and all things that are sin or have been made unclean because of sin. We also learn that God is good. All that God made, God himself declared it to be good. When God finished his work in creation week, God himself said that it is very good. Everything that God does is good because God is good. Therefore, when Satan lied about God's law in the garden, that to eat of this fruit would actually be good for her, for she will become like God, knowing good and evil. He was lying, because all that God does and all that God says and all that God makes is good. And so, in that sense, we only understand God to be good, and we also see that God is gracious. Instead of immediately giving to mankind the merits of our deeds in bringing eternal destruction immediately upon Adam and Eve, God actually extends to them not immediate death, but death and a separation from God, but yet promises them life, that there will be a seed that will come from woman who will crush the serpent's head. He provides the line of Seth. And we see over and over God is gracious in the way that he treats his creation and especially his regal creatures. This will only be developed as we enter into Exodus and see Israel enter into covenant with God at Sinai. But we have learned some things about God's people. It is helpful, and I think if you're going to choose one thing to talk about God's, you could call them God's elect, you could call them God's redeemed. There will be very soon, we will be calling them Israel. At this point, at the end of Genesis, we have been following the descendants from Isaac's line, and that is, we now call them the tribes of Jacob. We've seen indeed his 12 sons were preserved by his son Joseph, providing food for them in the famine, and that's where we'll pick up in Exodus. But when you think of all of these people, Adam, Seth, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, we'll then now refer to them as Israel. I think we should say God's people. So that will be a term that I will use in a technical way to refer as like the bracket category to refer to all of God's redeemed people in the world. And no matter where we might fall into redemptive history as we're picking up our Bibles and reading, but what we learn about God's people is that they are his creatures. He owns them, he claims possession of them, and he expects them to be absolutely obligated to him. We also see that they are his image bearers. Even for those who are not the chosen line, therefore, I would say those who are not God's people, they still bear God's image. And that's why he's absolutely just in rendering to them the wrath that he gives to them for the violation of his own image in which they bear. But we are coming to learn that not only does God have people to be his image bearers and creatures, but he now stipulates that his people will be in covenant with him. And so God's people are his covenant people. That covenant that Abraham entered into, especially as we begin in Exodus, it is going to be the foundation for all that emerges out in the book of Exodus, and really all that continues throughout the rest of the Bible. And so God's people are his covenant people. I would just therefore challenge you, as I have personally been challenged to, and now I welcome this. If you are a Christian, then you have to think of yourself as, I am a part of the covenant people of God. Now, talking in this language, number one, reflects what Scripture reveals about God as he enters in redemptively to save a people for his own name's sake. But it also sees what God's plan is in the world. And the Torah is really establishing us to understand this is what God is doing in the world. But as we reflect upon our relationship to God as his covenant people, this also enables us to understand I am God's because of God's covenant, which is wonderful good news. That it's not necessarily because you made a decision on a very important day, and maybe indeed you did make that great decision to repent of your sin and put your faith in Christ. But that's not really the defining feature of your relationship with God. And when you say, I am a part of God's covenant people, those people whom he has redeemed, you are now tying yourself to God on the basis of what God has done in making that covenant. That's a totally different rock upon which we understand our relationship to God. And we see this developed in Genesis, and especially it's going to develop throughout the book of Exodus and really seal all of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And it's what we also have when we think of what Jesus accomplished for us in his death and fulfillment to God's plan and promises, is that we enter into the new covenant relationship with God through Jesus, the mediator of that covenant. And so that's one of the things we learn about God's people at the end of Genesis. This relationship that we call a covenant does have certain features that we are able to observe in the book of Genesis. And we need to keep these in mind as we continue throughout the Torah. One, we see that God's covenant relationship with his people establishes the future return of that new garden-like place where God's people will dwell in God's presence in that land forever. That's very significant when you think about what then does this covenant relationship bring to pass for God's covenant people. Restored eternal fellowship with God. It also does, this covenant relationship, we do find it resting in one sense on a law of God. But where we find ourselves in Exodus is there is no law of God that has been revealed. We've just had Adam have a particular command in the garden, a prohibition that was given to him that he broke, and thus he was cast out of the garden. But then we have read what was Abraham declared to have kept? God's law, his ordinances, his statutes. And so Abraham, the one who indeed believed God and was declared righteous, yet he is the one who kept these statutes. And yet we do not find any law so far. Thus we are able to see, even before the law given to Israel at Sinai, we are able to see that God does have a moral fixed standard by which his people will relate to him. And this is before the Mosaic law even is given. We also see that God's covenant relationship requires faith in the recipient of these covenant blessings. The doctrine that sinners can be declared righteous before God was not invented by Jesus and his apostles. It was established in the first book of the Bible with Abraham, who is rightly called the father of the faith. And Abraham is our key example throughout the Old Testament. And so faith is required to be a recipient of the covenant blessings of God in his redemptive plan. We also see that God is the one who makes them righteous. Indeed, Abraham it was counted to him as righteousness when he believed God's word in Genesis 15. He did not do something to become righteous. And we clearly have seen that even God's elect people, they're scoundrels. So, on a practical, literal basis, they are not righteous folks at all. But that doesn't mean that they are absolutely the same in every sense as those who do not have this relationship with God. But God is the one who makes his people righteous. And thus, all of this relationship that God is establishing since Adam's fall in the garden, God is continuing to bring forth his plan according to his promise. And we see it now has formalized itself in the covenant of Abraham. It's all on the basis of grace. Right? Can you go through any part of Genesis and find, oh, God was now obligated on the basis of man's righteous works to give to man what he was due? We do not find that as the basis for God's covenant relationships up to this point in the Bible. We find that God chose Abraham not because he was righteous. He came from Ur. There was in no sense a mark of godliness. God just chose him. And then we follow from the seed that God chooses to be the line of blessing. And we see that that's all on the basis of God's gracious choice, not on the basis of the particular one he chose. Thus, we do, I think, conclude that this covenant relationship that God has entered into with Abraham, that is given to his line of blessing, Jacob, Isaac, Joseph, will now see the nation Israel. We see that all of this is a relationship based upon God's graciousness to them. And so with that, we enter into the book of Exodus, the second book in the Torah. Now, this is the big picture. This is wonderful to see. I love the way people help me. And I'll tell you two different places I'm getting help. This is a great little book. You see it's little. It's Dominion and Dynasty by Stephen Dempster. He's a Baptist, or at least he teaches at a Baptist school, so therefore I assume he's a Baptist. But this is a great little book, and it's little, but it's weighty. Not weighty in the sense that you can't read it, but it really is explaining dense things. But I have really appreciated and helped this book. It is the method that Dempster is using to explain the message of this is the whole Hebrew Bible explained in this little book. And the method that he uses is called biblical theology. And so if you'd like to pick up one book, I would suggest this book. Even though he might have as his intended audience pastors and seminary students, I still think it is very readable. This one is just on the Exodus, and this is probably written at maybe a slightly lower level of reading than this one, but not much. And this is just on the Exodus. And one of the things that we're going to see is we've already seen, and we will see it developed in Exodus. Exodus is already a very significant framework for us to understand what God is doing. What happened when Adam sinned in the garden? Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. L. Michael Morales. He's not a Baptist. He used to teach at Reformation Bible College. Now he's at Greenville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. This one is Dominion and Dynasty by Stephen Dempster. If you want to peruse it, you can't take these away from me right now, all right? Maybe after we get through this class, you can take them away, but you can peruse them and see what you think of them. But I find both of these helpful. But just to think of Exodus as already a significant exile. I'm sorry, Exodus is a significant framework for us to understand what is happening in God's world and what God is doing. What happened when Adam sinned? Yeah, he was exiled. He was exiled to the garden. Well, what happened when God called Abraham? He had to leave, and he had to go to a place that God would show him, to a land that God would show him. We're going to see that in Genesis 15 there was even a promise that was made. What is going to happen to Abraham's descendants? They were going to be taken to a strange land and enslaved. Right? All of this is going to be, we're going to see constantly and purposefully in the Old Testament that God is continuing to, in one sense, lead his people out in order to lead his people in to the land that he has promised them. This literally will be the case in the book of Exodus. It will continue throughout the Torah and continue to be taken up throughout the Old Testament. But we will find that it doesn't stop with the Old Testament, but continues through the New Testament. So you can think of it, you can simplify in God's plan for his people in this world is he is taking them out in order to bring them in. And that works on so many different levels. But Exodus is going to indeed, with its own title, take this up. And so we are able to see the big picture when we look at chapter 1, verse 7. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. Exodus begins with the sons of Israel filling the land of Goshen. Literally, we see that stated in verse 7. But the book of Exodus is going to take us from how did the sons of Israel fill the land of Goshen. Now turn to the last chapter in Exodus, Exodus chapter 40, and look at verse 34. Daniel, I'm going to ask you to read it.
Verse what?
34.
And the cloud covered the tent of glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle.
So we go from the sons of Israel filling the land of Goshen, that is the beginning of Exodus, to what is the grand end of Exodus. The sons filled Goshen. The Lord's glory fills the tabernacle. Now you go from just the inhabitants of Israel's descendants filling Goshen to the end of Exodus, and we have a tabernacle, and we have the Lord himself descending into that tabernacle in the midst of the nation Israel. A lot happens in the book of Exodus. How do you go from filling sons in Goshen to the Lord's glory filling the tabernacle? Well, the book of Exodus is going to take us there. All right, so that means we're covering a lot of ground that's dense and it has details, and it's also going to be significant for us as Christians to understand. For it is not only a message that is telling the history of how this happens, it is also pointing us to what God is doing for his saving people in Jesus, the seed of Abraham. Yeah, Jerry.
Between tent of meeting and the tabernacle.
That they're referring to the same thing. The tent of meeting is like, so if Moses went to meet with the Lord, where did he go? He went to the tabernacle. But because that's where Moses went to meet with the Lord, They called it the tent of meeting. So I'm going to take a three-part division of the book of Exodus. There's a few different ways that people divide it, but this is, I think, helpful, and it also frames it in a way that connects us with understanding the larger framework of the Torah. And that is the first section, and we'll begin that tonight, is the first 18 chapters of Exodus, God's gracious redemption of Israel. God's gracious redemption of Israel. The second part, chapters 19 through 24, God's gracious covenant with Israel. And the third section is Exodus chapters 25 through 40, God's gracious presence amid Israel. You have that in your handout. Now, we've been reading the Torah, and therefore we read Exodus, having also read Genesis, and yet knowing more is to come. And that is important as we take up the book of Exodus. And Exodus itself, in the first 7 verses, connects us with the book of Genesis. Verse 1 reads, "Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household." And so we are connected to these 12 sons, and therefore all of their descendants. We could call them their 12 tribes. And then in verse 6, we read, "Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them." Now, at one level, if you were not a Torah reader, you might not pick up on the significance of what is stated in verse 7. But we are Torah readers. So we're not missing the significance of what verse 7 is saying to us. Right? When we read of the people of the first 6 verses, and we read of the place in verse 1, what do we know? How do we connect and associate both the place, Egypt, and the people, Israel's sons? These are real questions, not rhetorical. Let's go with geography first. What Egypt is not, that's the way we think as Torah readers. Okay, it's not in Asia. It's not the promised land. This is not what we now find referred to as Canaan. So what therefore do we know? This is not the end, all right? We are clearly not where God has promised he is taking his people. So we are able to see God's people indeed are in exile. But we also are able to associate what's the significance of these people, these sons of Israel. All right, we'll get to there when we talk about what happens when what we read in verse 7. But again, these aren't just any 12 sons. These are the descendants of Abraham. These are the descendants of Isaac. These are the descendants of Jacob. These are his sons. And what is significant about that? To whom? Abraham. What this is we immediately come into the book of Exodus, and our framework of thinking is the Abrahamic covenant. First 6 verses. Now, when we get to verse 7, Tim is right. We now pick up on things that even predate the Abrahamic covenant. What was Adam and Noah, what were they commanded to do? They were to fill the earth. They were to multiply, and they were to fill the earth. And what did God also say Abraham's descendants were going to do? They were going to be fruitful. They were going to multiply. They would be like the sand on the seashore. Right? So in that sense, we're able to see, and this is, if you can remember back in Genesis, that the way God has blessed his image bearers is by commanding them to be fruitful and multiply. And so what we're able to see in verse 7, how would you then interpret the statement in verse 7? But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them.
It's the result of the promise.
Exactly. It is the result of God's faithfulness to his covenant promise to Abraham. That's why we are able to read that yet they have multiplied and that they have filled the land of Goshen. Right? That is the way we read the Old Testament. If we're not reading it that way, we're reading it wrongly. And Exodus is, in that sense, continuing what we have already learned from the book of Genesis. The genealogy, as we are concerned with Abraham's seed. The geography, as we are concerned with the land promised to him, Canaan. And that's what we immediately see. Dempster writes this text is viewed in the context of the geographical and genealogical dimensions of Genesis, and in the wider context of that storyline as it unfolds, there's a more profound reason why blessing for Israelites is a disaster for the Pharaoh. The series of events leading up to the Hebrew genocide is seen to work out the struggle between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman mentioned in Genesis 3. So now we're going to see what follows, but we see that the first stage of this first 18 chapters of Exodus, God's gracious redemption of Israel, really requires that he has to redeem them from certain circumstances, namely enslavement. But the themes of the creation mandate and the Abrahamic covenant emerge immediately with Israel's fruitfulness and Goshen. But in addition to those references of what we've already learned in Genesis, we already see that this is fulfillment. Verse 7 is fulfillment of what God has already revealed to the patriarchs. In Genesis 46, verse 27, this is to Joseph. I'm sorry, this is to Jacob. But there was a question that he had about what is going to take place of the people. And I think I got my address wrong here. But there was a question. How did I get this wrong? And the question was as they were coming to Egypt, there was concern about what is going to happen to them. And this is it is in 46. But Jacob was asking, and God appears to him in a vision and makes a promise that God is going to be with them, and they are going to multiply, and they are going to fill the land. This is exactly what you don't want to do when you're teaching a class.
How about 46 verse 2? And God spoke to Israel in vision.
Yes, thank you for rescuing me. Verse 3, he said, I am God, the God of your father Isaac, and do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will surely bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes. Right? So we see God's keeping specific promises that he made to Jacob with his sons moving to Egypt. But we also see that he's keeping, in one sense, the prophecy that he revealed to Abraham in Genesis 15 in verse 13. There, he revealed to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. The book of Exodus is going to show God keeping these promises. God indeed prophesies, reveals that which he is going to do in the future. And Exodus is going to tell us that. But we see in verse 7 that indeed God is keeping his promises. God is fulfilling the prophecies that he has revealed. So Israel's existence in Egypt, as well as Israel's fruitfulness in Egypt, is really whose work? God's work. Now we've seen that very much people are involved in that, and that sort of paradigm that Joseph gave to his brothers in chapter 50, verse 20, what you meant for evil, God turned for good. That will continue to be the paradigm that works throughout the Exodus. But we do see that all of this is God's work that he is bringing to pass in order to fulfill his covenant promises. Creation and covenant bring about the nation of Israel through the events of the Exodus. I want to say that again. It is creation and covenant that are going to bring about the nation of Israel through the Exodus events. Because is there a nation of Israel at the beginning of Exodus? No. That's right. Just a whole bunch of Jacob's descendants running around in Goshen. But the reason we know that all these sons of Jacob are running around Goshen is because God is faithful to his covenant, and God has indeed revealed what he is doing. And so we turn in Exodus, starting in verse 8, that there's now the struggle. And this, in that sense, takes up, and we should have at some level, we'll just call it, you could call it a theological, I maybe would prefer to call it like a biblical theological framework of interpreting individuals in the Old Testament. But here we find Pharaoh is now going to struggle with Israel. And we see in verse 8, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And so there's a number of different interpretations as to exactly when this is and what particular Pharaoh this would be. And what we are able to see is, did Moses reveal who the Pharaoh was? He did not. And so we're going to continue and just know what happened is there was a change of leadership within Egypt, and the new Pharaoh was not like the old Pharaoh in relationship to Jacob's sons, because this Pharaoh didn't know Joseph. He wasn't indeed intimately acquainted and favored Joseph. And this new king of Egypt, what did he say in verse 9? What is the consequence of God's indeed promise keeping to Jacob's descendants so that they multiply and they fill the land of Goshen? How does he interpret God's blessing? They're too many, too mighty. All right. In this sense, he's doing very much what our president is also concluding about. We have too many and they might be too mighty, and they don't have America as their primary, interest. And so Pharaoh is looking at who are his citizens within the land of Egypt and what are going to be their primary allegiances. And he judges that the descendants of Jacob are not going to have a primary allegiance to the Pharaoh, and so he sees them as a threat. And so we have the first scheme that he devises against the seed of Jacob, and so he makes them slaves. And so that's the first strategy. But what does verse 12 tell us about this first scheme of this new Pharaoh? What's the result of his scheme to suppress the number and might of Israel?
It didn't phase God's plan. It didn't.
All right. It tells us what happened. That's right. Exactly the opposite comes about. So instead of suppressing their might and number, they actually come to multiply. And the more they spread out, they're able to see the more the Egyptians were in dread of the sons of Israel. Verse 13, they have a new strategy. What's the second scheme? Labor. Let's intensify their labor and let's make their lives bitter. And so they added to their labors. And so he tries this. Well, another one comes about in verse 15. And what did he tell the midwives to do? Verse 16. Kill the male sons. Kill the male sons. All right. What happens when you take away males? Okay. One, it means now Egyptians can have the daughters and take them as wives, and then they will just beget Egyptian children. But by taking the males away, the others, you take away any sense of protection and provision. Right? We can really learn a lot about politics by just reading the Old Testament and seeing, even in that sense, the schemes of the seed of the serpent as they war and fight with God's chosen line. Like this, Satan, in that sense, he has like repeat schemes. And notice here, what is Satan, as he is working through Pharaoh, what is he aiming for? Where is he striking? Okay, and like, how do you strike at the strength of a people? You strike at the men and the sons or the boys, which is striking at the family. Sorry. So the reason that we see repeatedly, and now we see the midwives, that they were to execute the sons, when you kill children, you're seeing like a repeat scheme of the serpent. The seed of the serpent is always striking the seed of the woman by trying to kill children, to take life. You also see that it tries to strike at the family. And so we see this battle indeed in the beginning of Exodus, so that for God to bring about the gracious redemptive of Israel, we see that there is God's continued blessing upon his people, because what the scheme with the midwives did, verse 17, is they feared God, not Pharaoh. And they didn't do as the king of Egypt had commanded, but they let the boys live. And then they explained this in verse 19, and they said it's because the Jewish women are more vigorous than the Egyptian one, and they deliver before they could arrive. And so verse 20 we read, so God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty because the midwives feared God. He established households for them. So again, scheme number 2 from Pharaoh results in exactly the opposite. We then see in verse 22, Pharaoh commands, this is the third scheme, every son who is born to you are cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. And so now he goes for another form of infanticide. And so we are able to see it's through throwing the sons into the river that Pharaoh thinks he is going to weaken the people of Israel and keep them under his hand. Now, what does this bring forth in chapter 2?
Well, the actual command.
All right,
It's
so
not really a command.
so Pharaoh commands all the Jewish boys are to be thrown into the Nile River. And we now meet Jude. Is that a hand raise? What does that bring forth? Moses. Exactly. So the third scheme of Pharaoh, in that sense, the ongoing feud and fight and enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, this fight now brings forth the one that God will rise up and use as the means to rescue and deliver Israel from Pharaoh. This is way Exodus is going to unfold what on the surface seems as this is not working out for good, God. And yet this is exactly what God is using to work out for good in fulfillment for his redemptive plan for his people. And so it's through casting the sons of the Israelite mothers into the Nile that we see one son, this special seed or special son of Israel, that is Moses. He is delivered through his own little ark. And it is Mr. Dempster who says that it is intentional that God chose that it would be both water, the waters of destruction, the waters of death, to be the way in which it seems that Moses would die, but rather Moses, like Noah, is preserved in his own little ark so that the waters of death do not destroy him. But it also is necessary that we pick up the very agency that Pharaoh employed to destroy God's seed, God used to bring about the deliverance of his seed. That will repeatedly be something we observe God doing. Now, it's not going to be an accident. The first plague, maybe you remember, is against what? Or it's upon what? The first plague. It's on the Nile. So again, Mr. Dempster suggests that it's not an accident God first chose to turn the Nile into blood. Water as an agent of death connects us back to the flood, but it also is going to point us to the agency of deliverance of Israel, that is the Red Sea, which will also be the agency of judgment for the Egyptian army. So Moses is saved from Pharaoh's efforts, which Pharaoh was seeking to preserve his house, and ironically, isn't it, in verse 10, that Moses is saved by Pharaoh's house and raised up within Pharaoh's house. And so, this is a fantastic book, isn't it? But it is a book. This is literature. Moses does want us to learn these things, but it is not just literature. This is God's way. This is how God works in the world. And so when it seems like who would be laughing supposedly last? It would be Pharaoh. It seems as if he has been effective and he has brought about the destruction. Meanwhile, you have this one seed of these two Levites drifting into the very house of Pharaoh, being raised as a son of Pharaoh. And so Moses is raised up like a very son in Pharaoh's house, chapter 3, verse 10. Now Moses now finds himself identifying in every way with Israel before Israel comes to experience the same thing that Moses first encounters. In chapter 3, verse 12, chapter 2, verse 12, we are able to see that Moses saw this Egyptian striking a Hebrew, and Moses struck him down and hit him in the sand. And then in verse 13, the next day, two Hebrews were fighting with each other, and Moses said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" Verse 14, but he said, "Who made you a prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." Now, in that sense, Moses now kills an Egyptian, is afraid for his life. Verse 15 says that Pharaoh heard of this matter. He tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now, Midian to us may not geographically be known, but this is in the wilderness of Sinai. And so Moses kills an Egyptian, flees from Egypt, and ends up in the wilderness of Sinai, particularly in Midian. Egypt, when God delivers them, they will have killed the Egyptian army, and they will be fleeing into the Sinai wilderness. So who did it first? Moses. We then are able to see what happens is in verse 16, a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they were shepherdesses, and so they bring the flocks, and Moses protects them and their sheep, and so he comes to their father, and he is given a wife, Zipporah, and he dwells there in the wilderness for 40 years. And while there, a son is born to his wife Zipporah, and that son is named Gershom, because I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. Does that sound about anything that we're going to read of Israel? The whole book of Numbers is the account of Israel wandering in a wilderness for 40 years, having no land, out of Egypt, but not into Canaan. God is taking Moses through the very same experiences that he will then take Israel through as a nation. Indeed, the solidarity, as well as the picture of what God is doing in his people, is first painted in the experiences of Moses before God calls him. But everything changes in verses 23 through 25. And this is the hinge that now is changing, and we will see God will call Moses. It came about, this is verse 23, chapter 2. It came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of their bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. God is mentioned 5 times in these 3 verses. And so what we see at the end of chapter 2 is God now is sort of on the scene, and it is the time for God to redeem his people. God has heard his covenant people cry to him, and God will now act according to the covenant that he made with Abraham. All of this then frames what follows is whose action? God's action. The events of the Exodus are the acts of God to deliver his people in faithfulness to his covenant promises. This will first be manifest in chapter 3 with calling Moses. Jerry, I think you had your hand raised.
And sons of Israel, reference to Moses observing Hebrews, fighting. How did the Hebrew thing get started there? In third, 11. Let's see, Hebrew.
Yeah, in verse 11 of chapter 2, Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. I don't know. Tim?
Explanation I've heard is that it's from Abraham.
Okay,
So maybe that,
that's better than my no answer. Well, now God, we clearly see what. We now see God is acting. Now is the time where God is acting in response to his people's call and in faithfulness to his covenant promise to Abraham and to Abraham's descendants, and he calls Moses. Now, the significance of the means of the call of Moses is necessary, I think, for us to take the remaining time that we have to look into it. The first 10 verses are God's call to Moses. And so Moses is shepherding. So he's working for Jethro, his father-in-law, a priest of Midian. And he's in the wilderness, and he is at Horeb, the mountain of God. And in verse 2, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight while the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, and to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I've seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Now, the call of God is significant because we're able to see, one, the where it takes place and the manner in which Moses is called. So it happens at Horeb, a mountain. It is called the mountain of God. Now, clearly, God is also going to call Israel where? At Mount Sinai. And how will God manifest his presence at Sinai? In a great and fearful cloud and flame that will be at the top of the mountain. And here to Moses, God manifests his presence in this bush that is burning with an angel of the Lord that is within it, and yet the bush is not consumed. Now, I think in both of these cases, here at Horeb and also at Sinai, these are the fancy pants word is called a theophany, which is in one sense, fancy pants words sometimes exist because they can't really explain it. And so we create a fancy pants word to basically say, here's a fancy word that says what it is, and I can't really say much more than that. But it's like a visual manifestation of the presence of God, which is different than saying you are now seeing God himself. So that's partly what's involved in the theophany. But God visibly manifests himself in this bush that is lit with divine fire. An angel of the Lord is in it, which I'm just going to say we do not know from the text, but I interpret this by way of inference to be the pre-incarnate Son of God. And maybe the reason that it is this way is after God entered into covenant with Abraham, what did God do? Do you remember? He made a sacrifice. An animal was divided. It was slain and cut in two. And who passed through that animal that was burned with divine fire? Not Abraham. God. Maybe that is why it takes this form, that this particular theophany harkens back to the Abrahamic covenant where God also was present and walked through a burning sacrifice. And maybe, at least I think there's merit to consider that. Other than that, I think we're guessing. But this is how and where Moses is called by God, and the particular mission that he is given. It's going to accomplish what God says in verse 8. It is to, one, deliver his people from the Egyptians. Two, to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land. So there's two aspects that are involved in that. It is to deliver them from Israel, and it is to take them to the land that God has promised. Now, all of this is God acting as Redeemer, Deliverer, in faithfulness to his covenant made with Abraham. So we make two notes from this call of God to Moses through this particular form. One, God's presence here at the call of Moses is, one, due to the covenant promise he made to Abraham, as well as what he is going to continue to do as he uses Moses to deliver Israel from Egypt. It will be the very presence of God that will be the comfort and assurance that is given to Moses and will continue to be with Israel as they wander through the wilderness. The second observation is that God's covenant is the basis for this deliverance. God's covenant to Abraham is the basis for this deliverance. God himself says in verse 6 that he is the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And he is also able to say in verse 9, behold, the cry of his sons of Israel has come to me. And so God is acting redemptively because God has already covenanted himself to these people in the Abrahamic covenant. Deliverance is the outworking of God's promise to Abraham. But that will mean that he will deliver them from Egypt. He will bring them out of that land into the land that he has promised. And in that sense, we will see that God will use Moses to deliver and to redeem and to bring into the promised land. Now, Moses responds in verses 11 all the way through chapter 4. And in verse 12 of chapter 3, we do see the presence of God to be the assurance given to Moses. Verse 10, Moses is told that he is going to be sent to Pharaoh and that he is going to bring God's people out of Egypt. In verse 11, Moses is saying, who am I? Verse 12, God answers, certainly I will be with you. And this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. So here we are able to see that it is the presence of God with Moses that is his assurance. This is going to be very significant because we've already seen we go from the sons of Israel filling Goshen to the glory of God filling the tabernacle. The presence of God is the significant, in one sense, grand end for which the Exodus is brought forth. It is not only so that Israel is brought out of Egypt and into the land of Canaan, it is also so that God will come to dwell among his people. So the assurance to Moses is already the presence of God with him, and that he indeed will bring them. He will bring them out. Now, God here reveals his name. And scholars have debated as to whether or not the name was known. Clearly, we have read in the book of Genesis, Yahweh or the Lord being used in the book of Genesis. but it's not addressed in this way. And so here we do see that Moses asks, what am I going to say when they say, what is his name? What shall I say to them? In verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And then he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent you. God furthermore said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. And in that sense, it is the reason that what is called the Tetragrammaton or Yahweh is the covenant name. It is the most holy and intimate name of the covenant God of Israel. It is because God used it in this way here, and it will come up again in the book of Exodus, that it is treated differently than the way other names for God were used. But he then goes on to say in verse 16 that there's going to be a divine reveal of this God through the Exodus. Verse 16, go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has appeared to me, saying, I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will pay heed to what you say, and you with the elders of Israel will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now, please, let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it, and after that he will let you go. I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed, but every woman shall ask of her neighbor and the woman who lives in her house articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters. Thus you will plunder the Egyptians. So here, I think what is also revealed is not only in the name that God is saying, I am has sent you, and that he is going to make himself known by his name, but also by the events of the Exodus. The plagues that will be brought about, God is going to manifest himself as I am to Israel and Egypt. So as we tend to say today, the medium is the message. I would say Yahweh indeed took that into account when he chose how he would bring Israel out of Egypt, such that by these means that he would show his power and judgment for Pharaoh's hardness of heart and refusal to let his people go, so that he now would manifest his greatness, that indeed I am is God. And we will see that in Exodus that is to be made known to Pharaoh and to Egypt as well as to Israel. So verses 16 through 22 is significant in Exodus chapter 3. That God's present work in Moses is due to God's faithfulness to the covenant with Abraham, but it will be done in such a way that God is going to show himself to be the Lord, both to Egypt and to Israel. Indeed, it hinges upon the disobedience and the hardness of heart of Pharaoh, but indeed that itself is God's sovereign plan. And so we see the Lord is sovereign in all of the events that lead to Israel's Exodus. And this is revealed to Moses before any of it is done. Right? So in that sense, God gives to Moses the mission. God explains to Moses that in the mission, I have a certain goal. I'm going to manifest myself through these signs that will be done that bring my people out of Egypt and to the land that I have promised them. But it will be because of the sin of Pharaoh that I will do this. So next time we are going to make it a little further, and we'll pick up some of the pace, and we'll finish probably in 2 more nights the book of Exodus. So, any questions? What you can do is if you have questions that come to you, you can either send them to me by way of text or just tell them to me, and I'll try to integrate them into the lesson. Or at the beginning of each class, I'll just say, okay, are there any questions? Whoop. All right, y'all are dismissed.